An explosive night in Russia.
A strike on the CHP in Oryol. A fire is burning under the station in Vladimir Oblast, and in Yaroslavl there are detonations at Slavneft Janos.
And in Oryol, residents have been left without electricity altogether. US nuclear tests. Russia is in danger.
But a major part of America's national security is making sure that this nuclear arsenal we have is actually functioning properly, and that's part of the testing regime.
Russia attacks Ukraine with a nuclear-armed missile. Europe is next.
Debris was found in the Lviv region. The missile traveled more than 1,200 kilometers.
The Kremlin old man started talking about a ceasefire at the front, though only a temporary one.
But only in areas where, according to his version, Ukrainian troops are supposedly surrounded. We
are ready to halt combat operations for a certain period for several hours.
It seems the unparalleled air defense isn't coping. There are new job openings in Russia.
The Russian Ministry of Defense has announced the recruitment of volunteers for mobile fire teams to protect oil refineries from drone attacks.
Less money, less motivation. Payments are being cut in the Russian Federation.
Payments to contract soldiers have recently been significantly reduced, dropping from the previous amount of 2 million rubles down to just 400,000 rubles. This is all because of a regional budget deficit.
Many people are now asking, how did this happen? What types of weaponry? Let's take a closer look in the report and then we'll discuss it exclusively in the studio.
Distances of hundreds or even thousands of kilometers are no obstacle for Ukrainian weapons. Russian oil refineries, well, that's it. It's obvious the refineries are fucked. That's clear even without saying it. Key facilities of the military-industrial complex and the Russian war machine. And recently, in response to the ongoing shelling of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, critical Russian infrastructure has also come under the sights of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Yeah, well...
Boris, look. Ah.
Where are we going? Now that's an attraction. Yeah, we've got...
When the Kremlin threatens Ukrainians with blackouts, Russians should also prepare for a cold and difficult winter.
If they threaten blackouts, for example, in the capital of Ukraine, the Kremlin should realize that a blackout will also come to the Russian capital.
For a long time, Western allies restricted Ukraine's ability to strike deep into Russian territory. As a result, Ukraine has built up its own long-range arsenal. According to the head of Ukrainian intelligence, Kirill Budanov, today 99% of strikes on Russian oil refineries are carried out with Ukrainian weapons.
At the time when all this started, when people said we were fighting with one hand tied behind our back, I tend to agree with your opinion that this is the correct interpretation of what was happening then. But now we have our own production, and it is precisely our domestic production that has given us the ability to use our forces and resources the way we see fit.
The Kremlin only understands the language of force. The best argument in any negotiations with Moscow is a powerful Ukrainian army and defense industry. In particular, the domestic production of long-range drones and missiles with which Ukraine regularly strikes targets in Russia located thousands of kilometers or more from the front line.
In order to somehow bring this war to a stalemate, to shift it, we need to learn not only to repel attacks, the enemy on the front line, but also to suppress their logistics and their aviation. That's why it became necessary, and I'm not even mentioning the need to strike at Russia's military-industrial enterprises and energy system. This is Belgorod, basically. Damn, there's no electricity anywhere in Belgorod at all.
If the simplest drones to manufacture are used for strikes on Russian oil refineries, jet-powered drones are better suited for military-industrial targets, such as the Polyanitsia, Piklo, and Bars types. Their technical specifications are not disclosed. Experts suggest that the range of these jet-powered drones is between 500 and 700 kilometers. The main advantage is their low cost compared to cruise missile competitors.
To such places. Two major cities, such as Moscow and Leningrad, which are currently considered to be the most heavily protected by the Russian Federation's advanced air defense systems, could potentially start getting hit by attacks every single evening. The bar will be able to reach, and I believe this should happen systematically.
For dessert, Ukrainian long-range missiles are in store for the occupiers. The long-range Neptunes and Flamingos have ranges of 1,000 and 3,000 kilometers respectively. The Ukrainian Pink Bird, in addition to its enormous range, impresses with a warhead weight of about 1,000 kilograms.
Usually the warhead of a modern cruise missile is 450, but at most 500 kilograms. As a rule, almost all missiles have a 450 kilogram warhead. What does a 1-ton warhead provide?
When it hits a target, for example, an industrial facility, 2 such missiles can completely disable it for at least a year. That is, there will be a single crater about 20 meters in diameter.
Russian terrorists who are shelling Ukrainian cities must realize that a mirrored strike is inevitable.
Next, we are joined by Roman Svetan, military expert and retired colonel of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Roman Grigorievich, hello, good seeing you. Thank you for finding the time.
I wish everyone good health.
Pokrovsk is on everyone's lips these last few days, and that's understandable. Today, President Zelensky gave an answer about whether Ukraine plans to withdraw its troops from the Pokrovsk area. What is your analysis? What does your intuition tell you? Will the armed forces of Ukraine be able to withstand this deadly onslaught of Russian occupation forces? Today, Zelensky mentioned a figure. About 170,000 Russian occupiers are currently focused specifically on this direction.
Well, at least over 100,000 are directly involved in combat operations or supporting these combat actions. Basically, the main 500,000-strong Russian army is backing up this 100,000. That's at a minimum, depending on the direction. That's why large forces are concentrated there, and the fact that they're gathering there has been clear since the spring of this year. In other words, the main direction, the main axis of attack was precisely the Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk regions, the Eastern Front. The main objective is to expand the land corridor. And to expand the land corridor, that is to reach the Azov coast, the Russians need at least 150 kilometers in order to deploy a serious air defense system. So that our anti-radiation missiles like the HARM, for example, can't reach this system. Their range is just about 150 kilometers. So this line is roughly around Zaporizhzhia, naturally. Along the land corridor, practically along its entire length, Russian troops were deployed. A second wave arrived recently, at least the equipment has arrived. And the fact that more than 100,000 would be involved in the search was already clear as early as spring, meaning the overall strategic direction. But in reality, after the second wave came out, mainly to the line of contact, it took at least a month and a half to 2 months. That's why encirclement could not be allowed. It was possible to do this by sending a sufficient number of troops in that direction to increase the density and firepower and naturally the density of personnel. But of course, to do that, it was necessary to withdraw forces from elsewhere, to remove the protection of the security forces, to put into action part of the security forces that are not currently needed for maintaining order within the country. There is such a part because half the population has left our country, so the remaining half, at least 50% of our law enforcement system would have been enough to manage. And the other 50% could have been systematically integrated into the armed forces of Ukraine, just as it is done in Israel. The Israeli model is the best in this regard, where it is simply impossible to get a government job without serving in the army. And in politics as well, including, I believe, Netanyahu himself. The rank of captain in the IDF, so it's not just for show. Everything is set up properly there. The system works and we should have the same. But at the moment, I see only moments of noise. That is, Russia in just the past few months has created a serious threat to our peaceful city garrison bit by bit. Moreover, this threat is mainly from the north. That is, from the north, meaning the Russians are approaching from the direction of Rodinsky. There was also a recent attempt to break through to Pokrovsk from the south. They've already come close. Shevchenko is a successful line of defense. They've held that building for a long time. In principle, they can at least hold them south of the railway and from the southwest toward Pokrovsk, that is between Volnovakha and Pokrovsk. But the approach from the north, from Rodinsk, is much more dangerous. However, it's also risky for the Russians themselves because this is the northern pincer that's now trying to encircle Mirnohrad, south of Rodinsk. They have entered part of Rodinsk as well. This pincer is dangerous for the Russians too. Why? because a similar pincer tried to break out to rush towards Dobropilya. It was squeezed from both sides, that is, from the flanks. And now, in several semi-encirclements and encirclements, it's being broken down into its components. In other words, this pincer is being destroyed, and the same thing will happen if there are enough forces, at least a couple of full-fledged corps. And if somewhere in Ushirsky's reserves there are such forces, then in principle, the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad problem can be solved. It might even be possible to completely unblock at least the northern part of the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration. Furthermore, it's clear that for several months it will be necessary to defend those Russian groups that have already entered Pokrovsk from the south, and Mirnohrad from the south and northeast. So such an opportunity does exist, but again, it depends on whether we have at least a couple of corps, once again, fully equipped corps to carry out such a task. If we don't have these corps, if we don't have reserves, then we need to make a decision for an organized withdrawal before it's too late. Because right now, at this moment, there are two options, so to speak. Within the next week, this will become clear. We can create a major problem for the Russians there, definitely. Why are the Russians now requesting several hours of an operational pause? They don't need to bring journalists in there. What they really need is an operational pause to regroup.
Roman Grigorievich, what could they manage to do? Obviously, this is a military trick, but what could they accomplish from a military standpoint in 5 to 6 hours?
They could manage it. First of all, 5 to 6 hours. That's just what was said. In reality, to bring journalists in there, they'd have to stop for several days. Cease hostilities, take control. It's an entire process. No one will manage to do anything in just a few hours, including with journalists too. But even if it's 5 or 6 hours, during that time, they can regroup those Russian units that have currently entered Pokrovsk, and they don't even have communication with each other yet. Why? Because our electronic warfare systems, our jammers are working. They don't allow them to communicate with each other. They don't allow them to make contact with the main Russian units that are located south of Pokrovsk. And that's why, naturally, a ceasefire, a pause would give the Russians the opportunity to regroup inside Pokrovsk, to bring them together into larger groups. Right now, there are, well, maybe 30 or a few dozen Russians there. But if they regroup, they'll form companies, battalions, and could take up some positions directly. Once that's settled, that's enough. In this current state, as it is now, it's enough. But if we don't do this, then we have a problem there. Additional units have been sent in to clear out these Russians, and within a week, they can be eliminated. The Russians understand this perfectly well, and so does Putin. That's why he's going to resort to this trick, this so-called operational pause lasting several hours. It will simply drag on for several days, and if you give them an operational pause for a few days, they'll bring up reserves, and then they might not be able to deal with the extra forces in the Rodinskoye area. Then, having brought up enough reserves and reorganized, they could take Rodinskoye, otherwise the pressure will shift to other areas. So this is a classic trap, and under no circumstances should you walk into it. By the way, this is yet another indication that the Russians are having problems there, problems of about the same scale as ours.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Well, let's hope that the military and political leadership is keeping the situation under control. After all, they keep saying that it's still too early to talk about the situation being hopeless. Let's move on to some more pleasant news. Ukraine is intensifying its strikes deeper into Russian territory. Now the strikes are happening almost like clockwork, and that's encouraging, and it's pleasing to see. Just in the past 24 hours, there have been hits in 3 regions of the Russian Federation at once. Then a completely logical question arises. What is making all this possible today? Which weapons are primarily responsible?
You noticed correctly, we can already see a systematic and planned approach to combat operations. When we reach a point where combat operations are planned, with systematic strikes following a certain algorithm, it's already been noticeable for the past 3 months. This means we've truly shifted to a real wartime footing. Frankly, we've started the war. It's only in August 2025, a full-scale war. This is exactly after the strikes on the enemy's rear began. No one has ever won a war anywhere without destroying the enemy's rear. Well, under the conditions of the third millennium, it's simply impossible to win a war just on the line of contact. Only strikes on the rear. So we've only just started hitting them on a large scale, at least in a planned way, since August, and immediately the results started to show. 1/5 of Russia's oil industry has been knocked out, and war is all about math. If you track the dynamics, then in a year for the Russians, that is by next fall, by the end of the year, that's for sure, they simply won't have any left. Oil industry. What is the oil industry? The oil and gas sector of Russia. It's the main flow of oil and gas into the Russian economy. In general, it's the industry that forms the backbone of the Russian economy, either directly or indirectly. The oil industry supports petrochemicals, metallurgy, energy, and so on. The entire Russian economy is in politics. That is, further attacks on the Russian rear will make it possible in the end, not only to destroy the Russian economy, but through the destruction of the Russian economy, to destroy the Russian empire. Because this flow of oil dollars will stop. They buy an army, they buy loyalty. The leadership of the republics that are part of the Russian Federation will bring down this Soviet Union. The strikes are now being carried out systematically, mainly on aerial targets. We don't have minutes yet. The police had ballistics. We already had it in Moscow. So while there are no ballistic missiles yet, the strikes are mainly carried out with drones and cruise missiles. The main drones, several of them were already mentioned in this segment, and I would add some really fierce ones to that list. The AN-196 are decent machines that carry out combat missions at ranges of over 600 kilometers. By the way, it's hard to stop our aircraft-type drones with missiles. These are now being used, and in large quantities, I mean. Russian military targets are being hit, and now even infrastructure and economic facilities are being targeted as well. And with those same Neptunes, Neptune struck several targets, and as for range, the Tarlovskaya has a range of over 400 kilometers, which means that long-range versions have already been used at least. Or recently, they showed the Neptune with conformal tanks, so-called additional external fuel tanks in the area of the fuselage, which make it possible to launch strikes at distances over 400 kilometers. And here the basic Neptune has a range of 300 kilometers. So the Neptunes are operational. This is a coastal missile system produced by the Luch Design Bureau. They used to make the X-35 missile, the X-35 Luna, as the base missile. The Luch Design Bureau developed this Neptune missile, which initially operated against ships from the air, meaning it was air-launched. Later, it was adapted for use on launches of the coastal missile system. Now, it also carries out strikes beyond just targeting ships. It was used to sink the Moskva and for other strikes, and now it also performs ground-to-ground missions, destroying Russian military targets. Well, in the rear, at distances of up to 400 kilometers, it's already a serious cruise missile. That's regarding the Neptune. Well, and there's information that it's about to take off, at least the pre-production tests, pre-production experimental so-called prototypes, up to about 10 of them. Only 10 successful launches with the mission accomplished are needed, and then it can go into mass production. The same goes for the Flamingo missile. It has a decent warhead. They approached it very correctly and skillfully. They took an aerial bomb, roughly attached engines, wings, and a control system to it. It's an aerial bomb with a jet engine, specifically the AI-25TL. I've logged 1,500 flight hours on that engine. It was installed on the L-39, and it still is, and thousands of these engines have been produced over the past 40 years. Even over 50 years, actually. It's been about half a century already. Our Zaporizhzhia Production Association has manufactured thousands of these engines. Now they're just lying around gathering dust. They were removed from decommissioned aircraft, and in principle, they can be restored for a single flight, just for one use. It's a cheap missile with a 1-ton warhead, but the FAB-1000 is a very serious bomb, meaning it really delivers a powerful impact with just one bomb. It's enough, for example, to destroy or halt the technological process at facilities like an oil refinery with a single aerial bomb. Or even if it's delivered as a missile, it's enough to bring operations to a stop. A metallurgical plant could be destroyed, for example, the oxygen shop, or in petrochemicals if we destroy the preparation system at certain points. These are critical points. Or for instance, at an oil refinery, if you destroy the crude oil pre-treatment unit, the desalination unit, or the distillation towers, the cracker, you can basically write off the whole facility. So such a possibility does exist. The main thing is for the missile to actually reach its target. That's the problem right now. It's already difficult to break through Russian air defense, especially head-on. Russian air defense near the front, the so-called frontline density, is increasing to the level of Moscow's and the Kerch Bridge, and it will continue to increase. So it's going to be serious there. We'll need to find ways to break through it so that our main strike missiles can get through and accomplish their combat missions. But there are no problems entering through Crimea and Novorossiysk. In other words, roughly speaking, from the sea at extremely low altitudes, missile drones can carry out combat missions in this southeastern direction. And further on from there, nothing has been done there yet, as we say in military terms, all the way up to the Caspian Sea. The main thing is that the range is sufficient.
Well, let's trust once again President Zelensky and our political and military leadership, who say that the defense forces are preparing new long-range strikes against Russia, because we understand perfectly well that one of these missiles, or several missiles in the future, will most likely become those very black swans, which could sweep away both Putin and his entire clique. But the enemy isn't relaxing either, and information has emerged that Russia has begun launching the 9 M729 missile at Ukraine, which is capable of carrying nuclear warheads. What are the Russians trying to demonstrate with this, and how critical is this situation, both for Ukraine and surely for Europe as well?
We need to be objective, and our cruise missiles are not a game changer. With dense air defense, Russian cruise missiles are absolutely not a game changer for our air defense, and even less so for Europe's. A real black swan for Putin would be our ballistic missiles, which their air defense won't be able to shoot down. They'll reach Moscow. A blackout in Moscow would cut off Putin's control over the rest of the capital. Just destroying the Ostankino TV tower, shutting down at least for several days, the flow of lies pumped into Russian minds through television would be cut off. This would already be the case. That blackout, the same picture, comes from a Russian cruise missile. Yes, a cruise missile that was developed decades ago. It's mounted on the same Iskander launcher, upgraded of course, but still mounted on the Iskander launcher. But its range exceeded 500 kilometers, which was the limit set by the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. In other words, the Russians were supposed to destroy it, and they either didn't destroy it, despite reporting that they had, or they restarted its production. Production of these cruise missiles with ranges over 1,000 kilometers means they are considered intermediate range missiles, at least for ground-based deployment. And it shouldn't exist by definition, so naturally the fact is that the Russians started using it. We're highlighting this so that it will be much easier for Trump to appeal, including to Congress. For example, when it comes to resolving the issue of launching nuclear tests or starting production, including ground-based intermediate-range missiles, according to their logic, there are none. Yours is the same Agap, but essentially right now. At the moment, this is a missile primarily for sea-based deployment. There are a few dozen launches. These are the systems that are now trying to provide it with ground-based launches, but so far that's not enough. We need to withdraw completely from this treaty, naturally resume nuclear testing, and so on and so forth. Right now, that's exactly what we're helping with, meaning our information, which at this point has been checked, double-checked, and we're making every effort. Trump will help launch this arms race, which the Russians definitely won't survive. China might survive it, but the Russians won't, just as the Soviet Union didn't survive it back in the day. If they get involved, they'll be forced to join in. If this arms race moves to a new level, a new round, they'll definitely be trying to catch up, trying to keep pace. This requires massive funding, and the Russians simply can't afford it. This is yet another mechanism for the collapse of the Russian Empire. That's why, of course, we will support Trump by providing him with additional information. Although in and of itself, what is a cruise missile? It can even go over 1,000 kilometers. The K-101, for example, has a range of 5,500 kilometers, or the Kaliber, which has a range of over 2,000 kilometers. So that's the comparison of their ranges. In other words, a cruise missile launched from an Iskander ground-based system simply doesn't have enough power, at least in its conventional version, even to surpass the main Russian missiles that are currently on active duty. Because in terms of combat payload and combat pressure, it's not particularly threatening. So for us, it's not a serious threat. And for Europe, it's not much of a threat either. That's in its conventional version, but it can carry a nuclear warhead. Now, in its nuclear version, yes, that's where the problem lies. That means at the very least, it will require a 100% response. That's the first point. Second, it's necessary now to launch a mechanism to track the locations of the launchers, the containers from which it can be launched. This is the main problem for Europeans right now.
Well, to be honest, that was a bit reassuring. Roman Grigorievich, thank you so much for finding the time and sharing your analysis. Let me remind our viewers that today my questions were answered by military expert, retired Colonel of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Roman Svetan. Until next time.
Goodbye.